going to share with you things I've been picking up along the way. I made it a New Year's resolution to make a kind of scrapbook on my phone of things that I noticed that made me think about teaching, things that I thought fitted in interesting ways with the ideas in Teaching Unplugged or in Dogma ELT. This is my abstract. I always like to remind myself what the abstract is because I'm very easily distracted. But I think, as Beta suggested, actually being distractible in the classroom is a good thing, because it often means that we're reacting to the learners, to their mood, to what they want to say, what they would be interested in talking about, and of course to the language that they're using. So my questions were, what does it mean to be there for our students? How can we be more present in class for them and to ourselves? And I think the them and ourselves is also important. If we're becoming facilitators in the classroom, if we're not holding on to all the information, if we're not holding on to the flow of the lesson, but sharing it in that lovely live lesson idea that Beta shared with us, then we're engaging in a different way as well. We're asking the students to be more present, but we're more present. And that's when it gets exciting, because we come alive. So there are challenges to this, because it's perhaps a different approach to teaching. It's not, how can I make sure that everything I need to happen in class happens? How can I make sure that I get through every minute? How can I make sure that we never run out of content? By standing back a bit and by having a framework approach to planning, we open things up. And of course, there are challenges there. We need to learn how to do it. It's not something to try once and then think, oh, that was difficult, I'm going to give up. It's something to try more than once. It's something to get better at, just as teachers, we get better at working with coursebook material, just as we learned all sorts of things in our early years as teachers. So there are challenges and there are upsides of teaching in the moment. In this session, we'll look at some scrapbook material, I hope inspirational, from the worlds of film, music, and medicine. I think film actually became TV in the end, to help us reflect on the nature of attention and to consider what might flow from a more active, responsive, and curious approach to teaching. Oops, there we go. So these are some of the people that we're going to meet. And on the right is our new book, which Lizzie kindly mentioned. And we're going to encounter these different people working in different fields. So these people are called Evelyn Glennie, who's a percussionist. She is a musician, and that has stayed in it. Rita Sharon, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her surname, who's a doctor and a literary expert. Then there's a still from a movie called Nadia in Paris. That's the black and white shot. Moving bottom left, we have a kind of vintage American chat show scenario featuring Dick Cavett, the chat show host, in the middle, and a fantastic pairing, an unlikely pairing of Janis Joplin and Gloria Swanson. Middle, we have at the bottom, we have a series that recently went huge in the UK, at least on Netflix, and became, probably the first streaming show to get the kind of talk about status around the country that traditionally shows shown on public broadcasters have had, a show called Adolescence. Broadly speaking, dealing with the impact of the manosphere and the influence of toxic masculinity on young teenage boys and also young teenage girls, who we heard a bit less from in that TV show. And then, as I say, there is that screenshot of the cover of our new book. So we're going to get through all of this, and I've tried to boil it down. So in scrapbooking, which I would encourage you guys to do as well, just to pick up things that resonate with you in terms of your teaching, or things that you think could take you in interesting directions, whether it's from the literature of English language teaching and the publications that we see in staff rooms, or whether it's from the wider fields of our kind of everyday encounters with culture in different areas. So the first thing, and you know what it's like, you make a New Year's resolution, and January, you do it every day. So here I am starting on January the 1st, and I read an article with a well-known in the UK percussionist called Evelyn Glennie. I think she might have been honored and is now Dame Evelyn Glennie. And she has a foundation called the Evelyn Glennie Foundation. And she described the purpose of that as being to allow everybody to have a voice. In other words, to speak, to hear those voices, then allowing a bit of reflection before the conversation continues. And that's pretty much a perfect summary of the ideas in the books that I've written with Scott Thornbury, Teaching Unplugged and now Dogma in Practice. This is what it means to teach the room and not just teach the lesson plan or the coursebook content. Allowing everybody to have a voice, so we hear from them, we learn about them, we hear their stories, and then we allow a bit of reflection, which in our world is probably going to be reflection on language. We might naturally respond to what they're talking about, and we should respond naturally because we're talking about a conversation here. But if people are speaking, then there's a chance to reflect on the language that's come out of that, to think about what we could help with in the moment as teachers by maybe correcting something that isn't quite right, by supplying vocabulary that they haven't yet got, or thinking about stuff we might come back to in the next lesson before the conversation continues. So it's a kind of, it's an organic process of conversation, reflection, input, analysis around language, and then getting back to the conversation. For each of these slides, I've got a little bit more detail from my scrapbook quote. So if you're interested, the Evelyn Glennie Foundation is all about teaching the world to listen, and they work like most foundations in all kinds of different sectors, encouraging people to focus on the benefit of listening to each other and reflecting. So if you want to Google Evelyn Glennie and her foundation, it should be pretty easy to do that from those reference points. Okay, now this was an interview, which I must have kept it for some reason. It was in the Financial Times Weekend magazine sometime last autumn, and something had made me keep it, but I hadn't read it properly. And then on the 2nd of January, so as you can see, my New Year's resolution is really on fire at this point. It hasn't been every day since then, nor does it need to be, but it has been consistent. And I just found this interview fascinating. And if you Google Rita Sharon, there are lots of fascinating articles about her. So she's a working doctor, as we'd say in the UK, or physician, but she's also an expert on literature and a literary scholar. And she focuses into patient stories from a kind of dual perspective, looking at them as sites of evidence about their medical needs and their life stories, but also as narratives. And so they become narratives that can be interpreted. The medical doctor and literary scholar, I'm reading from the slide now, argues that tuning into the poetry of patient stories makes for best practice. And I love that idea that our narratives as human beings are a kind of poetry. But if we don't listen to each other, if we don't create the space to hear each other's stories, and I'm talking about the classroom in particular here, then the poetry doesn't happen. Why on earth, she asks, would you start anywhere else but tell me where we should start? In other words, in a sector, in a profession, which is a bit like teaching, traditionally very much focused on the expertise and the experience of the teacher or the physician, she's putting the student, or the student, she's putting her patients, and I'm suggesting we put our students on an equal level. We're all people, and we start by listening. Where should we start? And she tells this fabulous anecdote on the next slide. So quoting from the article, if you want to Google it, probably firewalled in the Financial Times, but there are uh, there are paywall-free articles about her elsewhere. The article reads, in the early 2000s, Sharon tried something new. After finishing a consultation and making notes like any doctor would, she says, I would turn the keyboard and the monitor around and say, I know what I saw, but please finish the note. I would leave them alone for 5 minutes, and they wrote the damnedest things. Lizzie kindly, I don't know if accurately, said that I was a revolutionary in ELT. I think this is a revolutionary idea for doctors. My own GP, general practitioner here in London, was unfortunate enough to hear me going on about this interview and this quote at the end of a consultation recently. The problem being, of course, I suspect Rita Sharon works in the private sector and she has the time to leave her patients alone for 5 minutes so they can write their own notes. I just think it's such a fabulously disruptive idea. What would be the equivalent of that in our teaching context? How can we make time? Is it a student review at the end of the class where we give control to them and we ask them to record what they learned, what they still would like to know more about, and so on? I've got a call coming on my mobile phone. I have in the past, sometimes in the classroom, taken calls. I'm not taking this one, we don't have time. I'm sure in taking live calls in the classroom, I was influenced by the late Mario Rinvolucri, who we lost this year, I think. So yeah, what a wonderful, simple, disruptive idea. I would turn the keyboard and the monitor around and say, I know what I saw, but please finish the note. And that's how she's getting the poetry of the patient's stories. Pressing on. I mean, this is a bit of poetry. I mean, it's part of the script to a short movie called Nadia in Paris, one of the first movies made by the French director Eric Romer, whose films in the 70s and unfold at a very slow, very kind of lazy pace. And this was just me on Instagram and just, seeing stuff pretty much at random and seeing a lovely moment from this movie. So it's a black and white movie, and we see the writer of the movie and the star of the movie, Nadia Tessich, I think, or Tessich, arriving at and sitting down at a cafe. And in French, she says that I have no particular aim in mind. I just sit. I'm not waiting for anyone. I just want to be there. I don't read, I look around. To be there, that's where I took the title of the talk. It reminds me of Be Here Now, the kind of hippie refrain borrowed from Buddhism, co-opted or appropriated from Buddhism, you could argue. And I think it's clearly not a practical idea. I'm not suggesting that we just turn up to the classroom and I just want to be here, guys. I'm just going to sit here. But there might be moments where not having a particular aim in mind would benefit you. If we're thinking of those moments where the students take center stage, if we're thinking of ways to kind of mirror what Rita Sharon, the doctor, did and gave them access to the computer to write their own notes, maybe there are moments where we just sit in class and where we're not waiting for things to happen and where it's enough to be there and to be attentive. So she's not waiting for anyone. She has no particular aim in mind, but look how much she's doing with her senses. So the full quote is, and it's beautiful in French. I'm not going to risk going to the site, but you can Google it easily. It's a fairly easy to find moment from this movie, Nadia in Paris. And she says, then I'll sit down outside a cafe, and we see her sitting down. I have no particular aim in mind. I just sit. I'm not waiting for anyone. I just want to be there. I don't read. I look around. I look at the street. how people walk, how they look at things. So she's processing an awful lot. And I think there are two things in there which are really key to teaching in general, and also to teaching in a more responsive and reflective way. Beta talked about how teachers typically are people. We like to be with other people. We respond to other people. And how it can be a difficult profession if we don't. I mean, I'm sure we can all remember teachers from our own school days when we were young who were just looked so happy. They wanted to be there with us in the classroom. But there were also teachers who looked uncomfortable, who looked bored, who looked as if they would rather be anywhere else. So wanting to be there is key. And also, it's just a basic of teaching. Look around, look at the people in the room, make eye contact, make sure you're bringing them all in. It's no good getting the poetry of one person's narrative and ignoring all the others. It's no good getting one student's story because they're quick to tell you for a personal reason, for a cultural reason. They're comfortable to just start talking. Make sure that you have planned that part of the lesson, or that you make time so that everyone gets the chance to contribute. It's not about our teaching, it's about their learning, to paraphrase something else that Beta said in her own talk. I think this is our shortest quote, and you'll be glad to hear that. So it's, I'm a big music fan, and I sometimes find myself on YouTube looking at old clips from talk shows. And Dick Cavett was a particularly successful and quite charming talk show host. And his interviews from the late 60s and the early 70s are particularly charming. The celebrities don't really have agendas. Sometimes they're extraordinarily unguarded compared with the sort of chat show interviews that we see today. And here he gives away part of his secret in a way. He remembers getting some advice from another host, Jack Parr, saying, "Kid, don't make it an interview. Interviews have clipboards. Make it a conversation." You know, in our context, don't make the lesson feel like a lesson plan. Make it a conversation. I mean, we can't always make the whole of a lesson a conversation. Sometimes it's hard to make even part of a lesson a conversation. But if we can make some of our lesson a conversation, then those memorable minutes that Beta talked about will be there for our students to think back on and to remember, and we can reference them in the next lesson. And the language that comes out of that conversation is memorable because it's relevant. It's what the students really want and need to learn. Full quote is here. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. So it's just a longer version of the same quote. I guess the best advice I ever got, or anyone could get, for doing a talk show, though it has not been easy very often. So even the pros, even the people who get very good at stuff, need to learn how to do it, was from Jack Parr. And there's that quote, which I love: "Kid, don't make it an interview. Interviews have clipboards." And then you're like David Frost, who was a kind of old school political interviewer from the UK. Make it a conversation. And, you know, make it a conversation in however way you can would be a wonderful thing to take away from this talk. And in the context of talking to each other, this is a slightly longer quote. And again, Instagram just produced this. The algorithm kind of did something good on this occasion. And it was an exchange between a Spanish teenager and a therapist, I believe, or the therapist, whose name is Melina Gonzalez, who was on Instagram, quoted the letter. And it was a kind of impassioned letter from this Spanish teenager in response to adolescence and saying what teenagers needed from their parents. But it's so close, I think, to what students need from their teachers, whether the students are teenagers or adults. Think about the resonance of this in our teaching lives. So this is a Spanish teenager writing after seeing adolescence and hearing adults talk about it. They say, he says, that teenagers don't talk. But what if we don't talk because we already know that they'll only listen to us to correct us? It's not that we don't want to tell them things. It's just that when we do talk, it's almost always to get scolded or to hear what we should have done. I mean, there's an awful lot to think about there as adults who work with children, or as parents, or as adults who have kids in the family. But I guess if I hadn't introduced it as being about the TV show, I could easily have said it's a student talking. What if we don't talk because we already know that they'll only listen to us to correct us? What if our students have the feeling that the only thing we're really interested in is correcting them, is making sure the language is right, and we're not interested in the stories? If we're truly interested in the stories, if we can share some of our own stories, whatever's appropriate in the context, whatever we feel comfortable sharing, so that we model the idea of talking, of sharing those narratives, then people will open up, and then that will give us language to work with. But let's not just correct it. Let's celebrate it. Let's work with it. Let's build what they already have. I'm just going to leave that up there. I'm hoping the font isn't too small. It's a great display font, but it isn't great at the smaller font size, I accept. That first paragraph is a teenager talking about his family life. To ask about us and not just about our homework. Again, there's a lesson in that for us as teachers as well. So una mama psicologa, what? Una mama, I should have practiced this, shouldn't I? Una mama psicologa is the page name, or the place to find Milena Gonzalez if you want to dig into her stories and find that quote. There's much more in that letter as well. Okay, I'm getting close to the end, and this is our final stopping point. And this does allow me to plug the book, Dogma in Practice. It's just come out. Now, Teaching Unplugged came out in 2009, and it's got lots of theory about teaching, and it's got lots of ideas for the classroom. What it doesn't have, and what we always wanted it to have from its first, so that from the first conversations I had about it with Scott Thornbury, was the voices of teachers. And this new book, Dogma in Practice, is full of the voices of teachers, many chapters of teachers from around the world in different contexts, teaching adults, teaching kids, teaching one-to-one, teaching online, teaching face-to-face, teaching in well-resourced classrooms, teaching in poorly resourced classrooms, and talking about how they've experimented with all the ideas that Beta and myself have been sharing tonight about being responsive, about being spontaneous, and about allowing the students to talk and share their stories. One chapter is written by an Egyptian teacher called Hassan Dajani, and he talks about setting up a lesson where the students were writing on a board in response to a task. So there was a plan, there was a task, but it was all about drawing out the language that the students had. And here he talks about them showing that they have this reserve of learned language that they passionately want to produce for everyone to see, including their peers, as competition. So he made a game of it. And if you want to read that chapter, then you can get the book. It's an amazing book, and it was a wonderful book to be involved with, because myself and Scott, as co-authors or credited as co-authors, were actually responding to the voices of teachers. The teacher chapters are center stage. And in a way, in a similar way to the way that I've been encouraging us all to think about our role as teachers, we're responding to them. We're bouncing off the teacher ideas, just as teachers, we can bounce off our students and their stories and their narratives. Those are screen grabs of the two books that I've mentioned, both written with Scott Thornbury, Teaching Unplugged. That's the one with the theory and the classroom activities. Dogma in Practice is a new one, and that's the one with all the teacher voices, and then our reflections on these chapters where teachers are reflecting on their own practice. And with that, I'm going to say thank you